So Bhante, on the status of the devas in the Buddha's sutras, they come up in this one as well quite significantly. I always thought of them as having moved past the cycle of rebirth and sort of being unafflicted beings, but it seems that's not the case. It seems
only certain class of devas are what you could call unafflicted beings, but the great majority are still beings within the cycle of birth and death. It's just that they occupy the realms of existence, let's say, where the lifespan is longer than that of human beings. They don't have the illnesses, the bodily illnesses that we're subject to. Their bodies are radiant, radiating light. They experience much more joy and happiness than human beings. They have maybe more power within their own spheres, but they're still subject to greed, hatred, and ignorance, and still subject to the cycle of birth and death.
And they fight with each other.
There's certain... It's supposed to be the devas, and then there's a class of anti-devas, the asuras, that fight with the devas.
But can you comment on when the Buddha refers to the devas as doing certain things or saying certain things? Are we to infer that that's something to look up to? Is this guidance for humans?
Generally, let us say, a heavenly rebirth is considered, in some respects, desirable, but not the ultimate goal.
Okay.
And there's, of course, the danger in the Deva world is that one could get sort of sidetracked by the greater pleasure, and especially the long lifespan there, to think that one is permanent and everlasting, and then one can be sort of swept away by the greater pleasure, so that you lose sight of dukkha, the noble truth of suffering.
Yeah.
So in that respect, human existence has that advantage. You're wrong? Wait, take the microphone.
Thank you.
I have a question, Bhante. If the goal is nirvana, to get out of samsara and the cycle of birth and death, what happens in nirvana?
Let us say nirvana or nibbana, it's an unconditioned state. So it's a state that is not brought into being by causes and conditions, and it's outside time, in a sense. Outside time, outside change, outside arising and passing away. So the idea of something happening implies changes within time. So from one angle, you would have to say nothing happens in Nibbana, but it's, I don't know how to, let's say it's an ultimate state of ultimate liberation, which is beyond all conditioning influences, and it's seen as a state of unconditioned bliss and peace and liberation. So those are, that's sort of the point where words, as far as words can go, beyond that, words are inadequate.
Thank you, Bhante.
But if you could find that my 10 discourses on Buddhism, that CD, it's here. Yeah, there's one, a whole 90-minute discourse on Nibbana. Maybe after this, somebody could take you to look for that. We had the CDs here. Yeah, but if you just go to the office, you ask for Mr. Lee. He's the one.
I think they're in the Great Buddha Hall. I've seen them.
In the Great Buddha Hall.
They're always there.
Yeah, you could go up to the Great Buddha Hall. There's a table where a lot of books and CDs. You look for, it's called I think the Buddha's teaching as it is, or is it just called 10 Discourses on?
I can't remember, but your stuff is there, definitely.
Yeah, originally I produced it under the title The Buddha's Teaching as It Is.
You've got CDs and DVDs. Audio teachings of your stuff.
Yeah, but this is just the CD, which goes back to like 1980, 81, something like that.
It also might be on YouTube. A lot of your stuff has been put on YouTube.
Actually, it is. They are.
Not just your stuff, I mean, so many.
Yeah.
Johns and teachers.
If you search YouTube by the title Discourse on Nibbana, you will find it first.
Is that a video YouTube or just an audio?
It is video.
If it's video, then it's not. It might be okay also.
It may be just audio.
If it's just audio, then it could be the one from 1980.
Yeah, they do have things that are just audio.
Yeah,
Pretty picture of like the Buddha, then, having audio.
yeah. But Mr. Lee will help you to find the CD. Yeah, that's how they must have done it, yeah. Yeah, then it's probably, certainly it's taken from the old CD. No, I don't care. That's not pirated, yeah. It's shared. Okay, is that Allison?
Yes,
I see a hand back. Okay,
I have two questions.
okay.
The first question is, Bhante, you're talking about when in today you talk about the sutra, and you talk the way the sutra talk about Jainism.
Yeah,
And my question is, as a Buddhist, what attitude or the learning mental investigation we should have when we are dealing with, in a sense, in the Buddhism Sutra, you can see they are anti-other sects
Yeah.
or anti-other
yeah.
schools, religions. How do we deal with that as a Buddhist? That's the first question.
Yeah.
And second question, I forgot.
You sure you forgot? Is it completely different from that question, or?
It is different.
Okay. Okay, I'd say that in dealing with other religions, one has to make a distinction. One has to first look at other religions and see, what we call Buddhism is a Western expression. And what the Buddha says he teaches is the Dhamma. And so the Dhamma, it's a universal principle of truth and goodness, that we say that the Buddha is the one who has fathomed the Dhamma in its multiple dimensions and its implications and teaches it in a way that's good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, and so forth. So, but the Dhamma, as that principle of goodness and truth, it's not unique to Buddhism, but there are aspects, let's say, of Dhamma, of truth and goodness that can be found in other religions. And so one has to examine the other religions to see what corresponds to the teachings of the Buddha that correspond to principles of goodness and truth, and that one would affirm and accept and say that that is good. But also one could look at other religions, and even, I have to say, the behavior of Buddhists and Buddhist attitudes, and see whether those square with the Dhamma, the principles of goodness and truth. And if they're in conflict, then let us say, certain teachings might be different from those of the Buddha's teaching, but maybe in themselves they're not harmful. In that case, we just put them aside, neither affirming nor rejecting them. But there can be other teachings from other religions which are contrary, both in doctrine and either in terms of doctrine or in practice, to the Buddha's teaching. And those one should reject. For example, if a religion teaches that it's good to sacrifice animals to the gods, to a god or to the gods, the sacrifice of animals is killing of a living being. That's contrary to the Buddha's teaching of non-killing. So we would reject that aspect of another religion. Doesn't mean one rejects the other religion in its entirety. If the religion teaches to practice charity or to help the poor or the needy, and we say that is in conformity with the Buddha's teaching, so that is good. So that would be sort of some general guidelines.
I have right now I remember my second question.
Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of Buddhists, that's including myself, we always said that we want to liberate, we want to be free. And we always talking about Nibbana, and we're talking about first jhana, second jhana, fourth, third jhana, blah, 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 blah. And I noticed that we have a lot of a desire.
Yeah.
And motivation. How do as a Buddhist, we're talking about letting go. We want to be free, but actually we do have a lot of greed there. What I'd like to ask you is that how do you deal with this paradoxical mindset or drive, paradoxical drive?
That's a difficult question. I say certainly desire itself for attainment, it's a quality that's encouraged by the Buddha. If one doesn't have a desire to attain, then one doesn't make the effort. And if one doesn't make the effort, then there won't be any attainment. So one needs the desire to make the effort. But let us say there's the distinction between a desire which is connected with craving and conceit, that one wants to attain some of these one wants to achieve some of these higher attainments out of a craving to possess that particular attainment as one's own. This is mine. And then also it can be motivated by conceit so that one could extol oneself or think oneself that one is higher than others who haven't reached those attainments. So one has to utilize the desire for the achievement to motivate the effort and to motivate the practice, but without pursuing them with the attitude of craving to enjoy something for oneself and without the motivation of conceit in order to build up one's own ego through the achievement of those states. Does that make sense?
I was thinking that when it came to Alison's question about, how do you distinguish between religions and which is better than the other, I think this is a process of self-discovery for all of us.
Yeah.
And each person will find their own unique path. They're born into certain circumstances, certain religions, because they have relevance to their growth. And similarly, if you have a craving for self-discovery, it's perfectly natural. I think at the root of it, the only thing one doesn't have to do is compare. Somebody else's path, their religion works perfectly for them. It's just so hard for an individual to start saying, it may not agree with me, but in their circumstances, the 40 years of their life that they've lived with their families in their countries, it's, it works for them.
Okay,
I think that's...
it's okay if it works for them as long as it doesn't, let us say, entail anything that involves inflicting harm and
Harm on
suffering on
others.
others. That's sort of the criterion.
Yeah, yeah. And invariably, I feel one thing, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just very optimistic, but I don't think there is any religion which is like that. I think it's just, each individual's maybe interpretation of it, but I don't think there's any religion which, is so different.
Well, let's say there are
From the
sometimes
other.
there are different
Yeah.
interpretations of a religion, and so there are some interpretations
Yeah,
which can be taken to be encouraging,
yeah.
inflicting violence against others, especially those who either within the same religion who don't subscribe to the same interpretation that you yourself subscribe to, or to followers of other religions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Looney Tune cults.
Yeah, though what I would say is that they could not really justify that on the basis of the Buddha's teaching. This is because of cultural attitudes. Yeah. Is that on?
Bhante, you were saying what went on in Sri Lanka, they couldn't justify according to the Buddha's teachings. And I was going to ask a similar question about what's going on in Burma with the Buddhists and the Rohingya. And I couldn't understand why that was happening. And as you just said, it's not consistent with the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I wanted to know if you could kind of educate me or tell me more about it and why that goes on.
Yeah, I don't have sort of a close connections with the Burmese Buddhists themselves, but what I would sort of conjecture, based on what I've read, of course, this is primarily an ethnic issue, which sort of spills over into the religious side. So there are a multiplicity of ethnic groups in Myanmar or Burma. The majority are the people who are called the Bama, or the Myanmar people. So those are the people whose nationality gives their name, or whose ethnicity gives their name to the country, actually. But it's called the Union of Myanmar. That was the original name. So it's a union of many different peoples. There are Kachins, Karens, Shan, Mon, various other ethnic groups. Okay, one of these is the Rohingya, who live primarily in the western state called Rakhine. Rakhine is the name of the state. And Rakhine state, it used to be an independent country, separate from what's now called Burma. But when the British took over, I think it was during the British period, they combined all of these different states together and then combined them and brought them under the Greater India. So they were incorporated into the Indian Empire, the British Indian Empire, the Indian Raj. And so there was no distinction of what we now call Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar. And so this goes back to like the 18th century, early 19th century. People from Bangladesh, what's now Bangladesh, came into Rakhine state and were living there. And these are the people who now are called the Rohingya. Okay, and they were accepted once Burma got its independence from Britain in 1948, something like that. They were considered a separate ethnic group. They were recognized as a distinct national ethnicity within the country, within the framework of the country. Then for some reason, this is what I don't understand, in 1982, the then government of Myanmar declassified them as a distinct ethnic group in Burma and deprived them of their citizens' rights and held that they were immigrants from Bangladesh who had slipped into Myanmar. And in that way, they started to marginalize them and to even to demonize them and to deprive them of more and more of their rights. Okay, now, over the last decade or so, there's come a certain section of the Buddhists in Myanmar, spearheaded by a group of monks, have come to identify being a true citizen of Myanmar with being a Buddhist. And so they've come attacks against the Muslims in Myanmar. And the Rohingya are only one of several Muslim communities in Myanmar. And so the Burmese monks who are speaking out against the Muslims are speaking out without discrimination against all of the Muslims in Myanmar. But because the Rohingya had lost their citizen status back in the 1980s, they've become the particular target of the attacks by the Burmese monks and then by the Burmese government that has been responsive to the claims of the monks. Yeah, so that is sort of my rough understanding of what has been taking place.
Thank you.
Yeah, but there will be probably more accurate accounts than what I've just said. If you look on the internet for Rohingya, Myanmar, you just do a search like that, you probably come across maybe a lot of hate speech also coming from Burmese-run websites, but there'll be reliable information actually coming from the International Crisis Group. Has put out several bulletins over the years describing the background to the crisis and giving the historical origins of the crisis, the International Crisis Group. Who is speaking?
I was going to say, I think one of the things you mentioned that's so important is that you can find someone in any religion that may be behaving in a way that's not consistent with the doctrine of that religion, whether it's Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Jainism.
Yeah.
So thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
Now when someone asks me, I have the right answer to give.
Well, if they ask about that question, I would say to go to the websites and get more information off some of those reports that trace the historical origins, rather than depending on my just off-the-cuff explanation.
Thank you, Bhante.
Probably Wikipedia also will have a lot of background information.
Bhante, I think you give a very good answer, Bhante. I am not following this subject closely, but apparently my understanding is that Myanmar considers these people illegal immigrants. It's a political issue more than anything else. And Myanmar has like 50 million people. Myanmar population maybe 50 million, but Bangladesh has 150 million people. And from what you see in the media, most of the people, they don't look like the Rohingyas who supposed to have come from the Middle East. They look more like the Asians like us.
No. The Rohingya have not come from the Middle East.
So there can be some concern that the Myanmar people are worried that they'll be completely absorbed into a larger community. Because India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, they are large communities, So it's probably a survival for Myanmar to be aware of this danger.
Yeah, the Rohingya in Myanmar are not recent immigrants. This is the claim of the Myanmar government and of some of the monks who speak against them. They say that they are Bangladeshis who have slipped across the border into Myanmar. Not so. They originate from what's now Bangladesh, but they were brought into what's Myanmar by the British, or they came into Myanmar back in the late 18th century, 19th century. And so their descendants in Myanmar go back, at least a century, 150 years or longer. And so ethically, of course, they're close.
But still, they can say they are people who came from outside without the consent of the country. That's the point. So which would be, for them, illegal immigrants. Because they came from across the border, like say suppose all the Mexicans come here, it's not a threat. Mexico's population is nothing compared to the US, relatively speaking, but not so in the case of other smaller countries, So I know this economic migration is there all over the world. A lot of people come and they use all sorts of excuses sometimes for the purpose of coming in, saying they're discriminated and whatever.
Yeah, but the ancestors, as I said, the ancestors of the Rohingya have been in that in that Rakhine state since the 19th century. Like my ancestors have been in the United States only since the early 20th century. What? Use the microphone, please.
In the 19th century, they were under the British. They brought,
all of that
even to
area.
Sri Lanka, they brought into the plantations. The Sri Lankan people didn't have the choice. You brought them. And they are no part of the country. So these are the issues that outsiders don't understand sometimes. So that's why I don't get into the subject for that reason. Because you must be there to know what their fears are.
Bhante, is there any other, did the Buddha lay down all the precepts or some of the precepts evolve, like not eating at the right time? My question actually is how does all the precepts or one of the precepts get created instead of just the first day the Buddha just laid down all the precepts?
You mean the monastic precepts or the 8 precepts?
Either one.
Yeah, I think certainly we could say that the Buddha would have laid down the 5 precepts, and then probably from the beginning of his teaching career. So when he was giving teachings to the laity, I think he would have made the 5 precepts a basic observance for the lay people. And then once he instituted novice ordination for the monks, then he would have instituted the 10 precepts for the monks. And then probably at a certain point, lay people wanted to have their uposita observance, something more stringent than just the 5 precepts. So the Buddha probably took the 10 precepts laid down for the novice monks and then compressed them into the 8 precepts, just dropping the 10th precept, combining 2 novice monastic precepts, and then you get 8 precepts. In the case of the full code of monastic precepts, those we could see evolved over time, over a long period of time, during the Buddha's life, and then there's debates about a lot of the minor precepts, whether they were actually developed during the Buddha's lifetime or whether they were just precepts that were then instituted by monastic communities in response to conditions and then ascribed to the Buddha to give them authority. But I think the basic code of what's called the Patimokkha would have come from the Buddha himself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bhante, when the first monks were ordained, the only ritual was taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There were no precepts as we know them now. I mean, they would have lived by a certain credo, but I don't think, if I remember reading, there were no precepts given to the initiates at that time.
I think when the Buddha instituted, allowed novices to join, then he prescribed certain precepts for the novices to take. That would be the 10 precepts. But for the bhikkhus, he didn't institute precepts or training rules. It said for the first 20 years, I think, because there was no need. The Buddha would just give certain advice, and then the monks would just follow his advice. But it's just when transgressions started to appear that he laid down training rules in order to curb those transgressions, to prevent those transgressions.
And during the Buddha's time, they weren't vegetarians as we
No,
know it now.
no.
That was something that came afterwards, I'm guessing, or?
Oh, probably considerably later, the requirement of vegetarianism.
Is that a requirement, or is
no,
it just?
I mean, let's say
it,
it's not a requirement.
it's just out of compassion that. I mean, I'm not saying just out of compassion, but that is the reasoning behind it.
It could have been partly in response to Jainism, because the Jainism was vegetarian from the outset.
They were more ascetic.
And the Buddhists might have felt the need to respond to Jainism, and it wasn't in mainstream Buddhism, but it was in certain Mahayana sutras have sections which strongly lay down vegetarianism.
And then there's a sutta where the one, I think it was before he was a bhikkhu, where he was following 5 precepts, and then all of his disciples were following 5 precepts, and he said, I have to be better than that. And so was that before the Buddha's time, or was that during the Buddha's time that he would have done that? You know this, what I'm talking about?
I know the sutta. If I remember, maybe this was depicted as occurring during the time of an earlier Buddha.
Right. I think that's...
I'm trying to see if I could find... It's in the Anguttara Nikaya.
5s, isn't it? Maybe.
Do you remember the name?
No.
Let's see. Yeah, I would have to...
So the precepts were in play even before the Buddha's time. Because if the sutta was, I think it was a previous birth of...
I'll just skip over that because I'd have to... My memory is getting rusty. I'd have to have a specific search word. You know what it is?
Oh, I got it.
Okay, we'll take one more, then we'll...
Robbie, did you pacemaker fall down? Thanks.
Bhante, these days a lot of people talk about peace and everything, but even recently I heard someone talking about peace. It's most important, but even more important, I believe, is love for each other.
Yeah.
If we have love for each other, loving kindness, compassion, Bhante, peace automatically follows.
Yeah, that is true.
See, people forget that and they talk of peace and this and that.
No,
and
I think people always
so
talk
sad,
about peace and love.
And to live together, for all people to learn to live together.
But at least, maybe love is a more difficult demand, but at least put down the weapons and try to solve conflicts through negotiation rather than through... Yeah, that's a very high standard. But at least to avoid the use of weapons is...
If it's agape, love doesn't have to be nice. If it's agape, using that, it's a better language or something. Agape, the concept of agape. The concept, Bhante,
Yeah.
heard of agape?
I know what agape is, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's love. It's a version of love. There's different versions.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean nicey-wicey, sweetie-deedy. It doesn't have to be
Okay, I think enough discussion for today. Okay, so we'll end with 3 half bows. Okay. Okay. Definition. Bhikkhu is